Well, good afternoon and good morning, and a warm welcome to all of you from Singapore. As director of the Center for International Law at the National University of Singapore, I have the great pleasure to invite to give our opening talk to this series, e-conference series, Professor Jayakumar. He is the former Senior Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, Minister for Foreign Affairs, and Minister for Law at Singapore, and importantly, may I add, Chairman of the Center's International Advisory Panel. Professor Jayakumar, can you please give us an introduction?
Thank you, Nilufer, and hello everyone in different parts of the world. On behalf of my colleague, Professor Tommy Koh, who's Chairman of the Board of Governors, Nilufer, who is Director of the Center, myself, and indeed everybody from the CIL family, welcome to this CIL's inaugural session and our very first e-webinar series, COVID-19 and the Challenges to International Legal Order. Well, friends, we all know that COVID-19 pandemic has caught the world by surprise. Countries, organizations, individuals have had to make major changes to life and to adapt to changes. CIL also, like many other organizations, have had to postpone our usual conferences and other events, but thanks to modern technology, we're able to meet each other virtually like this. And I'm glad that so many of you have signed up and we welcome you. Some 430 people have registered, and I'm very glad for this fantastic response. This e-conference will bring together international and regional experts to reflect on different dimensions of the pandemic from perspective of international law. Our aim is to provide a forum in this region to examine and discuss the interrelationship between COVID-19 and the different aspects of international law, as well as to contribute to the regional perspective. Perhaps it's worth my stressing the focus is going to be on the international law perspective. And I stress that because there is really so much political posturing, recriminations, and blame game, which is dominating the headlines. Well, before I begin an overview of the sessions, let me place our conference in the context of public international law. COVID-19 actually has shaken the global order in many ways, including creating pressures on the international legal order. We all know that our modern international law system was constructed to give central stage to multilateralism. And this has shaped international relations since the founding of the UN. International cooperation is core to this, which in turn depends, I would say, on robust international institutions. But today, what we are seeing is that the pandemic has brought pressures on the system. So during the next few weeks, we hope we can increase our understanding of what these changes might mean for our future international legal order. So now let me quickly outline the sessions. Today's session, our first session, we explore the COVID-19 pandemic under the International Health Regulations 2005 and the framework of cooperation of the WHO. What are the legal obligations of states and the WHO under the IHR? And how have they fared under the current pandemic? What powers does the WHO have to promote the needed cooperation among states in situations like this pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic also raises, in my view, some foundational questions about the design and operation of the WHO and global health governance in general. Of course, these are early days, but the panel, I hope, will seek to identify the key challenges, governance gaps, which might have been revealed, and to discuss possible ways forward. The second session next week, Wednesday, 6 May, 4 p.m., is COVID-19, International Law and the Clash of Rights. That session will explore the juxtaposition, or even in some case, clash, shall we say, of rights under international law, which might have emerged as a consequence of the pandemic. Issues will be examined, I hope, will include issues like, to what extent can a state claim sovereign rights to protect itself and its population against a pandemic, to deny access to medical supplies or the right to assistance relief or cruise ship entry into ports? Is there impact on human rights, for example? What questions of international responsibility do such acts create? Is there a duty on the international community as a whole to render assistance and relief? And finally, how does the United Nations response has been to this global crisis? The third session, Wednesday, 13th May, 4 p.m., all of sessions are 4 p.m., is International Trade and Investment Law in the post-COVID world. We know that many countries have taken urgent and emergency measures to contain and mitigate the spread of COVID-19, including, for example, diverting medical supplies and equipment from manufacturers and imposing export bans on medical supplies or medicines. Now, has the COVID-19 pandemic created trade protection for public health purposes? And what implications does this have for existing international legal order? Next, on Thursday, 14th May, 4 p.m., we will look at investment and dispute settlement in post-COVID world, post-COVID-19. The fact is that states have been compelled to take many measures, a wide range of measures, in response to the COVID-19 crisis. In some cases, states are actually restricting the inflow of foreign investments to protect domestic enterprises. More broadly, social distancing, lockdown measures, as well as compensation measures for businesses, all these have significant economic impacts on existing domestic and foreign investors. Can these measures give rise to investor claims under investment guarantee agreements, whether in the aftermath or even during current crisis? The panel hopefully will explore the implications for investment law and the settlement of investment disputes of measures taken by states. Now, last session on Wednesday, 20th May, 4 p.m., we'll examine where is ASEAN in COVID-19. And that session will be presented by my good friend, Professor Tommy Koh, who is chairman of the Board of Governors. ASEAN region has gained much experience during the previous SARS pandemic. In this session, I hope experts will discuss the measures that ASEAN has put in place previously and to what degree those measures have facilitated ASEAN's response to this crisis. I hope the session will give an opportunity for experts to examine in detail how WHO recommendations, international health regulations, and shared best practices from other countries have impacted in the ASEAN arena. Are there, for example, lessons from this experience where ASEAN can make use of international law and regional resources to better protect itself and ASEAN peoples in future? So those are the sessions. Let us now start with today's session. We have excellent speaker. I now pass the floor to Nilufer to introduce them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Jayakumar, for that excellent introduction. Well, it is my great pleasure to welcome so many participants and some very good friends and colleagues from around the world to this very first session of the Center for International Law's e-conference series. It's also a tremendous honor for me to moderate a panel with such eminent experts in public international law and also the field of global public health and policy. We are truly fortunate to have our guests today. Now, before we proceed, however, I also wish to give some important acknowledgements. I have to acknowledge the very valuable support given to the preparation of this e-conference series by first, of course, our chair, Ambassador at Large, Professor Tommy Ko, and also the Attorney General Chamber's office, in particular Daphne Hong and Lionel Yi, who will also be participating in future sessions. But last and not least, the wonderful team at CIL, my dear friends and colleagues, Jerry Ng, Zue Chan, and Angela Lim. Now we're going to continue. Well, it is impossible for me to give full credit to the many accomplishments of our panelists, but in the interest of time, I will be very brief in the introduction. Our first panelist is Professor Gianluca Burci, former legal counsel to the World Health Organization, and he is currently adjunct professor at the Graduate Institute of International Development Studies in Geneva. Our next panelist is Professor Tikki Pangestu. Also, he was a former director of the Research Policy and Cooperation at WHO. And now he is a visiting professor at Lee Kuan Yew Public Policy here at the National University of Singapore. Dr. Ayelet Berman, also a dear colleague and friend, who's adjunct assistant professor at the National University Faculty of Law and a senior research fellow at our center. But certainly, last but certainly not least, we have Professor Tony Anghie, who is professor of international law at the National University of Singapore, and also he's head of our program at the Center on Teaching and Researching International Law, known also as TRILA. Now, to the audience, before we proceed, I just want to explain very briefly our session. What we're going to do is have a series of questions that I will ask to the panelists. The idea is that this should be a discussion and not so much a lecture. And then, while we're slotted for 2 hours, I think what we'll do is after we complete the session of the round of questions, then we'll open up for about 30 minutes of questions from the audience. So we may actually leave before the 2 hours. All right, well, now I'm going to start with my very first questions, and that is going to be to Professor Burci. Professor Burci, as former legal counsel to the World Health Organization, I have to say we could not have a more experienced person to explain to us the role of WHO and in particular the 2005 international health regulations. If you could perhaps walk us through the regulations, give us some background on them, a bit of the history. You know, many of our audience may not appreciate the long history of pandemics and infectious disease that actually led to the establishment of the WHO and the regulations. Looking at issues, for example, is why are they important and what role have they played in the COVID-19 pandemic? I give the floor to you, Professor Burci.
Many thanks, and many thanks for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to see old friends again and to such distinguished co-panelists. So let me jump straight into your question. And I think it's good that you put it in a bit in an historical context, because health law is not exactly a mainstream topic for many international lawyers, both students and practitioners. And so many people think that WHO is the first international organization on health, and the international regulation that we have on the shelf since 2005 are the first instruments of this nature. But it's actually the latest configuration of a long history of regulation, institutionalization, and cooperation in the field of health that goes all the way back to the 19th century. And the focus of this was precisely the protection from epidemics. In the 19th century, it was cholera and plague. Today, it's a basically endless string of new pathogens or mutating pathogens that come out, in particular from animals. Most of them are of zoonotic origins. So there is a history behind this. And WHO itself, if you look at the constitution, was created with a broad mandate, but the core is clearly the prevention and protection against epidemics, against communicable diseases. And from the malaria, tuberculosis, neglected tropical diseases, and so on, to HIV/AIDS, which was a game changer in global health law and governance. And then, as I said, these what public health people call emerging and re-emerging diseases, hemorrhagic fevers like Ebola, like Lassa, like Marburg fever, pandemic influenza, these coronaviruses like SARS, MERS, COVID. And I must say the Asian region has been at the forefront of this. Because countries like Singapore, South Korea, and so on, went through all these diseases. And that for many people explains why, for example, the Republic of Korea has been so good at managing COVID, because it had a long history of experiencing this kind of shocks and was well prepared. Now, so the need for international cooperation to protect from epidemics has been evident for a long time. At the same time, and that's I would say a leitmotif for health governance, health is never the paramount value. It's very important, but it's always balanced against other values. For example, trade, for example, security. Today, human rights at the forefront of the discussion on COVID and so on. So the challenge has always been, from a political and legal perspective, to find the right balance, or the politically acceptable balance among these values. And if you look at history, it's interesting because there are continuities and changes. The international health regulations were revised thoroughly in 2005, because the old system of having a list of diseases, having a rigid set of measures, and have a rather passive role for WHO showed the limits. It just didn't work. At the same time, if you look at history, and history is a great teacher, should never be forgotten, you find similar political issues at a time of colonialism, today of power differentials between developed and developing countries. You find the role of science, which is a constant variable that in a way shapes the politics and shapes the law. COVID is a good example, even though science develops every day, basically. Whereas in the 19th century, cholera took decades before there was an agreement where it was coming from. Still, scientific uncertainty still drive a lot of the problems, but also a lot of the solutions. So I'm not going to the basics about WHO. I hope that most of the audience at least will know the very basics about the organization. It's an organization with a very broad mandate, but 2 points. The first is that it was supposed to be a very strong normative organization, really being the global central rule setter for the whole world. And for a number of reasons, it's been very shy in implementing these functions. It has only adopted 1 treaty on tobacco control, still a groundbreaking instrument, and only 2 regulations. Regulations are legally binding instruments based on the constitution of WHO, but we have only 2. One more technical one, and I will not talk about it, and the other is precisely the international health regulations. The regulations, as I said, were overhauled in between 2003 and 2005 because of the impact of the SARS crisis, because of the awareness that the old model wasn't working anymore, because of the difficulty in finding an alternative model that led states to basically codify what WHO was already doing in practice, in the sense of a very open textured approach, which basically covers any event that can spread disease internationally. So not only the COVID kind of epidemic, but also, for example, a nuclear accident, a chemical accident that spills toxic chemicals in an international river, and significantly also acts of terrorism. If COVID had deliberately been released by a terrorist group, the health effects of COVID will still fall under the international health regulations. So it is a public health instrument with a very strong political component, very strong security component. And that's part of the dynamics of this instrument. Now, if you want me to give you like a very, very quick overview of the basics of the international health regulation, the main purpose is basically surveillance, alert, guidance, and coordination. These, I think, are the 4 pillars of the international health regulations. And it's important to say that because there are many misconceptions. Some people think it's an operational instrument that can materialize billions of dollars and thousands of people, or is something like a weapons control convention where WHO can act like an international police force or a body of inspectors. It's not the case. It's a fairly sort of loose instrument, but that tries to guide the international community, first of all in preventing, but also containing and controlling the international spread of disease. The IHR, let me use the acronym, of the regulation is based on a number of assumptions and is based on a set of obligations. On the part of states, the fundamental obligations is acting in good faith and transparency in assessing health events that occur on the territory. And it doesn't matter to put a label, this is disease ABC, because very often it's very difficult, but just is something unusual happening in your territory. The regulations have actually like a decision tree, like an algorithm, and states have to run what they know through that algorithm. And if you check a number of boxes, you must notify WHO. It's an obligation. And from that triggers, if you want a dialogue between WHO and the states, very innovatively, WHO can also rely on non-state notification because often, unfortunately, states are reluctant to notify for a number of reasons, or they don't even know what happens on the territory. And so WHO can use internet sources, can use reports from other organizations, from NGOs, and can confront the state. Basically, look, that's what we are hearing. You need to verify and let us know what you find out. That's also an obligation. And WHO can disclose what it knows if a state is reluctant. So there are means of pressure to try to achieve transparency, which is very important to give evidence and to give a balanced set of information for international response. So transparency, cooperation, self-restraints, good faith, and also crucially, and that's something that has been probably an act of over-optimism, states need to achieve what the IHR calls the core capacities. And that is not just to have a laboratory or an isolation room at the airport. It has to do with the public health system of every state. It's very intrusive in that sense. It goes deep into the public health policy of states. States need to have a public health system that are able to do surveillance, detection, prevention, and control. And that has proved to be a huge challenge. There are many developed countries that have not been able to achieve that level of basic preparedness. And that's one of the open questions in the, if you want, in the design of the IHR. So I can stop here if you want, or I can go on and give a little more description of the mechanism of the IHR. I'm guided by you, Nilufer. You need to unmute. You are muted.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, I think you started us off very nicely, giving kind of the broader context to it. But perhaps if I could just follow up with COVID-19 pandemic. I think it's, for example, for myself, I'm not an expert. And we hear words like, you know, public health emergency of international concern. What was the duty to notify? There's the duties of consultation. How does this work exactly? And if you could just perhaps explain to us how the regulations actually were implemented in this particular pandemic, and then we can have a functional idea of it.
Sure. So yeah, I stopped halfway through because I described what states are supposed to do. Now I come to what WHO is supposed to do. WHO in a way has a very active role, unlike past versions of the regulations under the current IHR. So WHO is supposed to, first of all, have a dialogue with the states concerned, gather evidence, do its own risk assessment, alert the international communities, put up basically notices, and try to, through that, to achieve, hopefully, even prevention, to try to nip it in the bud or to contain the outbreak. The system of alert is based, as you said, on the concept of public health emergency of international concern, which is the horrible acronym FAKE. And in an era of fake news, I couldn't think of the most unfortunate acronym. So I'll call it emergency. I don't like the word fake. The emergency, I just made a mistake. The emergency, if you look at the definition, is fairly loose. Because again, the IHR apply to an indeterminate set of possible problems that spread disease internationally. So it couldn't be too specific. And that I think is realistic, but it also opens the event to interpretation. And the mechanism is that when the event reaches a certain threshold of gravity, the Director General consults with a committee of experts, of individual experts, called the Emergency Committee, that is supposed to have the sort of, if you want, representative specialties and expertise in public health, from virology, epidemiology, risk communication. There are also aviation experts and so on. And they advise the Director General, does the event check the boxes of an emergency? And if so, what should be recommended to the world in how to address the emergency? Now, also this aspect has been criticized because between 2009 and now, we had 6 emergencies. And if you look at the criteria, they varied very much, but that's inevitable because no 2 events are alike. Some people have said there's a lot of politics there. And so it's inevitable because I think WHO is a technical organization and its decision and recommendation need to stand the scrutiny of public health. But at the same time, we should have no illusions. Declaring an emergency is an act of high political importance. And so sometimes there is a need for consultation, there is a need to make sure that what will happen will not generate such an opposite reaction that will frankly be counterproductive for the public health response. So the challenge is how to manage, if you want, the interface between public health and politics. And this all is managed by the Director General. It's a huge responsibility for the Director General. And the IHR delegate a lot of authority to the Director General. Just the fact of declaring an emergency, theoretically even against the will of the state where the emergency is occurring, and adopting what we call temporary recommendations, which are recommendations of urgent measures that have to be reviewed every 3 months. So in the case of COVID, China notified WHO on the 31st of December 2019. As you know, there is a lot of speculation and a lot of criticism. Did China know about this before? Probably did. Did it delay its notification? Probably did. And so that's part of the controversy going on. But the fact is that WHO was triggered on the 31st of December. And from there was a first alert a few days later. WHO kept sending alerts and kept giving initial guidance based on what it knew, based on what China notified. The criticism is, well, why WHO was so reliant on China? Couldn't it, reach its own conclusions? WHO can, but only if it has alternative sources of information. And frankly, a country with a level of social control and frankly, control on internet as China, it's very difficult to have alternative sources of information. It may be easier in other perspective, but not in that one. So that may explain why WHO in a way is so reliant on the information coming from China and on the analysis provided by China. And so a month expired, a month passed by until WHO declared its emergency. The emergency committee met twice. The first time it could not reach a consensus, in particular based on, do we have enough evidence of human-to-human transmission? That's another controversial aspect. So the emergency was declared on the 30th of January, and there were temporary recommendations, in particular for other countries, for China, and controversially, the recommendation was don't impose travel restrictions. My problem is there wasn't any elaboration, there wasn't any explanation why, and that to me is a weakness in risk communication, especially since countries are already setting up defenses. So that's the history. Since then, if you look at the narrative, the IHR have largely disappeared. If you look at WHO's website, you hardly find a reference to the IHR right now. You find a lot of guidance, very good, I think very important for countries, for enterprises, for many people, even for individuals, how to protect themselves. But the IHR is a bit taken a backseat. We can wonder why, we can discuss why, but the emergency committee will have to meet this week. After 3 months, that's an obligation under the IHR. And we'll see whether the WHO will try to re-inject the IHR in the current management of the pandemic. But that's, in a nutshell, the chronology of how the IHR has been used in COVID-19 until now.
Thank you very much. And I think that perhaps there are a lot of questions, and we'll probably get to these later, of course, and I'm going to now go on to our next panelist. But in terms of what obligations are of states, what triggers a notification, it's questionable just how clear that is. And I think that there's a lot more that's not clear than clear in these regulations. But we will continue this discussion. Thank you. I think you have certainly set a very good context for our panel. So now I would like to turn to Professor Pangestu, and here, of course, I know you have a great deal of experience in the policy side, but also as a scientist, and you spent 13 years with the World Health Organization. So if I could ask you, this pandemic, what is your assessment of the role and the response of the WHO to the COVID-19 pandemic? And for example, how does it compare to previous pandemics, such as the SARS pandemic, which was particularly important in this region?
And let me thank my old friend Luca for providing such a thorough and clear background to the IHR, which makes a good backdrop to what I'm going to say. But in direct response to your question, and perhaps in this case, I'm not exactly objective because I used to work for WHO. I still passionately believe in the importance of the organization. But to answer your question, I believe that the WHO's response has been both appropriate and correct based on its mandate. And it has been consistent with its responses to previous pandemics. So that's a simple answer to your question. I'd just like to elaborate that there is a lot of misperception out there about what WHO can and what WHO cannot do. And that's led to a lot of the misunderstandings that Gianluca has already alluded to. What can it do? I believe its most important function is what Gianluca has already mentioned in terms of setting norms and standards, best practices, which serve as guidance to its member states. And the IHR and the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control are just two of the highest, let's say, most powerful instruments. But WHO provides norms and standards for a whole range of other issues through guidelines, through standards, through codes of conduct and codes of practice, ranging from the treatment of malaria to vitamin supplementation in children to water quality. So those two are just two examples of the norm and standard setting function. The second function, which once again Gianluca has already alluded to, is its convening power. That is just, in my 13 years working with WHO, I just had to pick up the phone. The top international experts will immediately agree to help with no fee whatsoever. And that's always impressed me. And the example, of course, is the emergency committee that's been meeting over COVID. That is, it's a convening power, not just over COVID, over a whole range of issues which especially deemed to be sort of controversial. Another example was intellectual property rights, where WHO played a very key role in convening all the parties involved that have a stake in patents, for example. The third function that it can do very well is as a clearinghouse for information, reliable information based on reporting from countries. Now, you can always sort of criticize by saying, well, this is governments that are providing the information. But the other thing that the international health regulation revisions have done is that WHO now looks at data sources, not just from the government, but for example, from private sector, from NGOs, to ensure the veracity. And finally, the fourth function that it does very well, obviously, is technical support to its member states in terms of advising and guidance. I just like to just mention what WHO cannot do, okay? And this is one of the misperceptions. I remember we were criticized very heavily during our response to Ebola, okay? I was not really satisfied with the way WHO responded at that time. For me, the problem is that people do not understand. WHO cannot send 100 doctors, 100 nurses, 100 field hospitals halfway around the world in 48 hours. That is not its function. It is not an emergency response organization. And Gianluca has already alluded to that. The second thing it cannot do is it cannot act as a global health inspectorate. It cannot tell countries to share information, okay? It does not have that sort of power. They cannot compel countries to share information like what was being said about China. It cannot instruct countries to do certain things. It can only advise and guide based on scientific evidence. So that's sort of my quick response, just to highlight what it can and what it cannot do. But once again, it's to emphasize its sort of norms and standards function and its advisory role. It cannot instruct and tell countries what to do. Back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think you've highlighted something so important, because there is a misperception it does seem that, unfortunately, there perhaps has been some politicization of the WHO, and perhaps seen as something that has more police power than it actually does. And this is something, again, our panelists can also reflect on these as well. But following up on that, then my second question, and you're a scientist, and I know you're an ardent believer in science-based decision-making, but has this been the case in the COVID pandemic? And I think that Professor Jaya have highlighted a bit of there seems to be a bit of a disarray. Countries are acting on their own. We see how much is being science-driven, and where does the WHO come in here? Which is very important because I understand that they provide the recommendations, guidance, but also the science as well, perhaps.
When I was at WHO, and Gianluca will remember this, I was in a part of the organization that was called Evidence and Information for Policy. So I'm as a scientist, I'm very passionate about that. And what I'm seeing, as Prof. Jaya mentioned, is all this blame game where essentially politics is trumping science. So many policy decisions are made based on anything but scientific evidence, on political pressure, on economic considerations, even on ideology. But just without going into too much detail, I think it's quite clear from my perspective over the years that WHO does not get into the politics. As Gianluca said, it's a technical organization. It's driven by science, data, and evidence available to guide countries in terms of its recommendations. And basically, it does not get into the politics side. If Mr. Trump and a few other countries have a political agenda to set up an inquiry into WHO, let them sort it out. We don't have a problem. We stand by our credibility and our role in this particular situation. And basically, at the end of the day, we support our member states through guidance, through advice. We don't get into the politics behind whatever influences their interactions with us. So I'll stop there before I say something outrageous.
No, okay, we'll let you stop right there. But I think, in one way, perhaps this has brought not always the attention it wants, but important attention to the World Health Organization, and everyone is learning more about it. And it's important. It played such a key role in the eradication of smallpox. So important. So I think you have every reason to be loyal to its cause. Now, my next question will go to my dear friend, Ayelet. And following up a little bit, not so much in the politics, but we do know that the United States did announce that it was going to withdraw some $600 million annual contribution. And I must admit, I didn't really know about how the funding worked for the WHO. So Ayelet, you're an expert on this. Could you explain to us, how is the funding structure, and what does this mean to be losing $600 million annually right in the middle of a pandemic?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for having me on the panel. Hi to everyone. Yes, so indeed, so the US basically have threatened or are cutting their funding. What the US pays annually approximately to the WHO is about $500 million. It's been declining over the years. Of that funding, about 100 million are mandatory funding, which means that as a member, they're obliged to pay this, and this is determined by a formula based on GDP and population. And then they have another chunk, which is about 400 million, which is voluntary funding. So this is really at their discretion, and any donor can basically decide how much they want to give. I think the Trump administration is talking about voluntary funds about that chunk, because if it would be the mandatory part, then they would lose their membership. And I don't think that, at least in the short term, that's not what they want. In the long term, we'll see, but in the short term, that's not the case. I think they're talking about that. More generally, in terms of the background of the WHO, so the funding of the WHO has really changed over the years. As Gianluca said, it's a member state organization that has 194 members. Used to be mostly funded by mandatory funding, so that the members had to pay a certain chunk. That was about 80% at the time. This has changed over the years. And now around 80% of funding is actually voluntary, with only 20% being mandatory, so that the members actually are obliged to pay. This is actually pretty amazing if you think about it, for an organization from which so much is being expected. But it's actually part of a larger trend that we see not only in the WHO, but in UN organizations in general. So they're increasingly being funded by voluntary donors. It could be states, could be foundations, could be other private actors. In fact, if we look at the entire UN system, about half of it is being funded through voluntary means. In terms of the consequences for the WHO of this funding model, is that, first of all, it's a pretty underfunded organization. So it really doesn't have a lot of money. Its budget now is about $4.8 billion, which is really not a lot given all the responsibilities and their huge mandate. And the other problem that comes with that is that because a lot of it is voluntary funding, most of it is earmarked, meaning that the donors basically decide where they want the money to go to. So it's really, the WHO has very little flexibility as to where it can use that money. So, I mean, in terms of the consequences of the US decision, first of all, assuming they can actually do it, because it's also a matter of US constitutional law, you know, the budget to the international organizations is actually approved through Congress. So it's not so clear that they could actually cut that, but leaving that aside, but I'm sure that they could at least, you know, delay and disrupt the entire process. So assuming they would actually succeed in going forward with this, first of all, I mean, it would mean that money that their voluntary funds are actually going to programs would have not much to do with COVID-19, polio, HIV, AIDS, and so forth. So that money actually, you know, there are many other health concerns that are outside of COVID-19. Basically, that money would get cut. Other than that, of course, it's very bad for an organization that, like the WHO, in the middle of the crisis. It's quite scandalous to cut the funding right now. So, you know, the immediate consequences, of course, is, you know, it's very bad for developing countries, because one of the major roles the WHO has is supporting developing countries, Africa, that really don't have the resources and capacity to deal with this pandemic. So, you know, the immediate consequence would be on them. But then, of course, you know, we're in a globalized world, so not containing the pandemic in Africa essentially comes back, you know, to all of us. So it's very short-sighted. In terms of who's going to step in now for this, you know, funding cut. So you already have the Gates Foundation, which is the second largest donor, also a voluntary donor actually, who's already pledged, the foundation has already pledged to give $150 million. And there are also other European countries, Canada, Germany, France, Japan have actually expressed their support for the WHO. And, you know, I would hope that their money goes where their mouth is, and that, you know, there will be more support going into that. There are also some talks about actually changing the funding model, given everything that's happening, to change it into from an 80-20 to a like 60-40 model, whereby there would be more mandatory funding. So, you know, this extra funding would have to come again from donors, private donors, or from governments, which would have to fill in this gap. Before I finish on this note, just kind of to put this in a broader context, I mean, it came quite shocking when the Trump administration, you know, said they were going to cut the funding, but it's really part of a much larger process of this administration, which has been attacking multilateralism from day one, through the Paris Agreement and cutting other funds. And actually, even, you know, before this, they were year after year proposing budgetary cuts to international organizations. And in fact, their last proposal was to cut all voluntary funding to international organizations to zero. And as I've just said, a lot of it is voluntary funding. So, I mean, that just shows you that the attitude of this administration, which means, you know, if they will succeed, because again, it depends on Congress, other states and other donors will have to step in and fill in this void.
Yes, thank you, Ayelet. And I think that the funding issue is one of these these issues that haven't really been talked about enough. And I think that we need to be focusing more on this, because the multilateral system does require that we have robust, healthy institutions. But I want to just follow up very quickly. You mentioned the Gates Foundation. And also, I mean, there's a lot of focus on the World Health Organization. There are other non-state actors very important in the public health domain. Of course, the Gates Foundation has really stood out. What is the role of civil society, non-state actors in public health, but also in this particular pandemic?
Well, first of all, global health is really an area where we've, you know, if you compare also to other areas of global governance, where we see a lot of non-state actors in the past 20 to 30 years. And that's been, yes, foundations like the Gates Foundation, but as you say, civil society organizations are very important. Then we have, you know, pharmaceutical companies. We even have, you know, scientists, academics. So, you know, the whole field has many actors except for the WHO, actually, many non-state actors, which are pretty active. The Gates Foundation itself has been one of the major actors, especially since the turn of the century. After Bill Gates left Microsoft, they decided to set up the foundation, which for the most focuses on global health. Also on education within the United States, but they've really focused on global health, have become donors of the WHO, but are really very much involved in response to infectious diseases. You know, setting up organizations like the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, or Gavi, which have been fighting infectious diseases in developing countries. And that's actually the background. That's why, you know, you've all heard the TED Talk by now, you know, because he's been in the business of infectious diseases for quite a while now. They've been very involved in the response actually to COVID-19. Also again through funding, using these platforms, but also really by, you know, funding other scientific initiatives. So I think they really believe that, like, you know, the science is the exit strategy for all of this. So funding a lot of initiatives like they call it the therapeutic accelerator, where they're looking for treatments, and the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness, where they're working on vaccines. So they've been a major player, and actually have now said that all of the foundation itself is going to focus only on COVID-19. Foundation has an endowment of over $40 billion. By the way, just to put this in contrast to the WHO, which has barely $5 billion. So they are a very, very important actor in the response to COVID-19. But as you say, there are also civil society organizations, which have always been very important in the response, especially in terms of, you know, the interface with developing countries, with vulnerable populations. And many of these, you know, like Oxfam or Doctors Without Borders, they're basically adapting themselves to give, you know, an emergency relief in this kind of situation. But they too are actually quite limited right now in what they can do, because, you know, they need donations, and obviously with economic crisis, a lot of that has been cut. So that's a major problem there. And also, you know, with the travel and trade restrictions, there are a lot of problem of access and supplies and so forth. But they definitely have an important role, especially in developing countries and with vulnerable populations.
Okay.
That answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, it definitely does. And I think the question about developing countries we're going to get to as well. I think that's such a key issue. But now I'm going to go to Professor Tony Anghie, who's an a professor of public international law, not necessarily public health law, but I think you can perhaps give us the broader context of the role of international institutions, organizations. We've already talked quite a bit about the World Health Organization, how it works, some of the issues. So how should we understand this pandemic and the challenges it provides or it has presented to global governance? Professor Anghie, the floor is yours.
Thanks. And I feel very honored to be part of such a distinguished event. I would also like to thank all our attendees. I think we have something like 300 attendees from all over the world, and it's a very challenging time. And so thank you for choosing to spend some time with us to try and understand this complex issue. I'm also very grateful to Gian, Luca, and Professor Pangestu and Ayelet for outlining so clearly the different dimensions of the operations of the WHO. What I thought I might try and do is to try and place this set of issues within a broader context of what we might call the challenges to global governance itself. I'm starting perhaps with a somewhat theoretical point, and it is raised by my very good friend and colleague. She teaches at the University of Melbourne, Hilary Charlesworth. She wrote a very famous article called International Law, a Discipline of Crisis. And her basic argument is that international law, in a way, is transformed, it is reconstructed, it is renewed by crises. And so that's one part of her argument. The other important question I think she raises is, how do we understand a crisis? So in this particular case, we could understand this crisis as being all about health. And this is why there is so much of a focus, quite understandably, on the WHO. And we want to understand, suddenly, the IHR and so forth are given a degree of scrutiny, which I think would be quite unusual. But we could ask the question of whether we should see this as, what should the response be? Should it be transforming the WHO, reconstructing the WHO? I think a number of proposals are already being made. Or should we see this crisis as being something more systematic, something more structural? And a crisis which also involves a whole series of other issues, not just of health, but issues of inequality, issues of the environment, for example. And I should say, the latter view. I think this is a systemic crisis which implicates a whole series of institutions and actors. Ayelet was mentioning non-state actors, for instance, so certainly they would be involved. But I see this as being a much larger set of issues involving a number of different actors. And that takes me to the issue of global governance. So I think Hilary Charlesworth gives us a very good, you could say, raises a very important issue. It only struck me recently that, we celebrate the creation of the League of Nations. It created a new world order. And it suddenly struck me that those negotiations in 1919 would have been taking place while a massive pandemic was raging all around Europe. And in fact, a good part of the world, a pandemic which killed 60 million people, far more than the First World War. And yet the focus was on war. In the League of Nations focused on the whole question of how to diminish war, which is understandable. But it's really interesting that this pandemic killed far more people than the First World War. And it was truly global in a way that the First World War really was not, even though we have this term. So what should we look at? How should we understand this crisis? I suppose that is the question I'm asking here. So I go now to the question of global governance. And I need a provisional, you could say, definition of governance. And so my provisional, very crude definition is something like, what are the rules which determine how the system works? Who wins and who loses? Which actors are empowered and which actors are diminished in this system, given that the system is a system of continuous contestation? And so here, what I thought I would do is, rather than focus on the WHO and seeing the WHO as being completely responsible for the whole issue of health, think about some of the other actors who we should also perhaps consider in terms of this broader vision or this broader perspective. So for example, the WHO tries to advance the cause of global health. But of course, that can only be done to the extent that countries have resources. And so then the question is, well, we go to a question of governance. What are the rules? What are the institutions that in many ways shape the issue of how resources are allocated? Which countries have resources and which do not? And so I thought I would contrast the WHO with another international institution, which I think is not directly considered, but which I think has a large role to play in this whole issue of global health. And that is, well, the International Monetary Fund. And I'll try and make the link between the International Monetary Fund and global health. So I want to try and make this a little concrete. And so I talked about governance as a system which empowers some actors more than others. And so here, I don't want to get too technical because this is a discussion, but I roughly want to compare the structure, the institutional structure of the WHO as compared to the IMF. So for example, we can go to the issue of funding. Ayelet has just told us that 80% of the funding of the WHO is discretionary. How is it possible to establish, I don't know, Tikki might tell us this, how is it possible to establish a long-term plan when everything is so uncertain? The IMF has no such difficulty. It is a very solidly founded financial institution, and it really hasn't made money despite the huge loans it has given over a long period of time. So it has a financial stability which the WHO does not. In terms of its actual legal status, it has legal personality. It is made clear in Article 9 of the IMF Constitution. I was having a quick glance at the WHO Constitution, and what I found interesting is the WHO has capacities. The personality is not directly granted to the WHO. Instead, the WHO has granted those capacities which allow it to function. Luca, I don't know what to make of this, but from an international institutions law perspective, I think there's an interesting distinction here. The WTO, for example, makes it explicit, we have international legal personality. A further distinction, we can see that with the WHO, we can see that it is very closely allied to the work and operations of the United Nations. It is an integral part of the United Nations. It was created pretty much under Article 57 of the UN Charter as a specialized agency. Now, if we have a look at the IMF, we find something completely different. The first thing to note is the IMF was created in 1944, before the United Nations. And so if we look at the articles of agreement that create the IMF and the relationship agreement between the IMF and the United Nations. Okay, again, I don't want to get too technical, but every specialized agency has a relationship agreement with the United Nations. And if we have a look at, and the IMF has a specialized, the IMF is not a specialized agency in the sense the WHO is, but it has a relationship agreement with the United Nations. And in that relationship agreement, the IMF says, we shall pay due regard to decisions of the Security Council. Very interesting, due regard to decisions of the Security Council. Now, every sovereign state which has signed the United Nations is bound to follow the decisions of the Security Council. The IMF says, thank you, but no thank you. We have due regard. So all I'm trying to say here is that if we look at the system of global governance, we can see how the IMF has extraordinary powers, which the WHO does not. A lot of the questions that I see here and some of the discussion has to do with the issue of why can't the WHO make its member states comply? Now, the reason the WHO cannot make its member states comply is because the member states do not want to comply. They did not enter into a treaty which required them to take these particular actions. They were very careful to guard their sovereignty. In relation to the IMF, countries pretty much have to comply if they are part of IMF programs because they are subject to the conditionalities of the IMF. There's much more financial enforcement power that is granted to the IMF than can ever be achieved through legal means by the WHO. So this is what I mean by saying global governance decides how the resources are allocated, who has power, who does not. And I'm just focusing on the IMF. Why is the IMF relevant to the actions of the WHO, and why should we consider the IMF in the context of this broader crisis? Well, for a fairly simple reason, which is many countries are subject to IMF programs, and there's a long history as to how this debt or these financial difficulties emerged and how these are being resolved. But in many cases, the IMF imposes austerity measures on the countries that receive their assistance. These austerity measures have devastating consequences on the health capacity of these countries. So can we see the tension between what the WHO tries to achieve, which is to advance health capacity, and what the IMF policies will actually, in effect, have an impact on in this context. Now, before, the issue of austerity was something that was faced principally by developing countries. I mean, particularly in Africa, if we have a look at the scholarship, there is a lot of evidence to suggest that countries have greater debt repayments than they do health budgets. So we can see the different aspects of the different actors, the different legal regimes, which all go to this issue of global health. And so in this context, what I'm trying to suggest is we need to consider these other actors because they do have a direct impact on this whole large project about how to advance not just issues of global health, but issues of equality and global environmental protection. So I'll just stop there because I think I've already spent more time than I should have.
No, thanks very much, Professor Anghie, for that. And I think time is going quickly, and one question that I think we have not gotten into, and I think we should look at, and I might raise this for now, each of our panelists, first starting with you, really has to do also with the question of equity, access to medical supplies. We know that there is, mad rush for vaccine. We know what's been happening with diversion of masks. We've also mentioned the issue of, the developing countries and perhaps a difference in capacity, although I have to say that we're looking at the capacity of advanced economies, and it's really rather shocking. So we're, in terms of what's the responsibility of the international community in ensuring this equitable access? We know there's a UN resolution that was adopted 20th of April. And so I'm opening this up, first Professor Anghie, but also to the other panelists concerning what the role of the WHO is, and how do we look forward in terms of the future. So let's start with the inequities, and I think this is something that Professor Anghie is very close to your heart, concerning the developing world and between the developed world and within the context of what's happening in this pandemic.
Sure. So once again, we can see that, in fact, there are already legal regimes in place. And the legal regime in place is, you could say, the most universal legal regime in place is the TRIPS, Trade-Related Intellectual Property. And again, if we look at the background as to how that whole treaty was negotiated and how it was made a part of the WTO in such a manner that it created legally binding obligations which could then be litigated. So a very interesting question here is, who is in a position to litigate and what rights can that particular party try to litigate for? So as a result of TRIPS, we found a situation where there was a global system of protection for intellectual property. If we look at the sociological background as to how TRIPS was negotiated, the pharmaceutical industry played a very large role in actually formulating the principles that then became universal. And under TRIPS, there are certain exceptions for emergency and so forth. colleagues from Africa will be very familiar with all this because these issues were played out in the context of AIDS. Because there was this whole tension between the protection of patents and then people simply dying of preventable diseases. Okay, and this is another issue I should raise in terms of inequity. We talk, now there's a crisis, but for millions of people, what they have to endure is what I would call an everyday crisis. Thousands of people are dying as a result of entirely preventable diseases and social conditions. So it's very interesting how this concept of crisis is constructed in this particular way. So all I'm saying is that it goes back to the issue of global governance. There's extraordinarily powerful protection for intellectual property, and there's also been, you could say, attempts to expand those protections even further. And that could very well have an impact on public health, especially in the context of developing countries. Now, there are a number of, happily, there are a number of initiatives being taken within the WHO and so forth, which are based on the concept of open science, a conglomerate of different actors who are trying to say, let's try and create a vaccine which will be available to everybody and would be available to everybody as, you know, perhaps as cheaply as possible. I think the polio vaccine, I understand, was made available to everybody. So what it's going to take is a political initiative which is going to be quite contrary to the existing international law. That is my point. And so here we have to understand that international law is not necessarily the solution to all these problems. That international law itself is in a situation of, you could say, tension, advancing all these different interests, patents versus health, for instance. And that's where we have to look at who makes the rules and in what way can those rules be reshaped. And it's interesting to know that in this context, because it has been such a trauma for so many countries, there's more of a political, you could say, a political sense that it would be so unjust and unfair for one country to actually get a patent or one corporation to get a patent and deny other countries this. But I'm just thinking aloud here, but from my understanding, there is an initiative going on, but neither the United States nor China wants to be part of that initiative. So all this is being also caught up in terms of what we might call COVID politics.
Yeah.
This is the situation we have to change. Can human rights change that? You know, these are the issues that we need to think about. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. And I realize time is going very quickly, so I think I'm going to have to do a last round of questions for our panelists, and basically ask you to answer either the question I find important, this whole question of equitable access, and also where do we go from here? There have been problems, it seems, with the current pandemic in terms of the international cooperation. And again, this vaccine issue really, I think, highlights trouble ahead. So how do we look at the future? What changes can we expect, if at all, for that matter? So if I can start with Gianluca on this issue.
Sure, thank you. In terms of access to future vaccine and antivirals, that's obviously a huge question now, and there is a lot of flurry of political activity. And I agree with Tony that what is happening now, the magnitude what is happening now, is clearly questioning the application of the current rules of international law, which tend to protect actually the rights of investors, the rights of pharmaceuticals, so to privatize pharmaceutical innovations through exclusivity rights, and basically then focusing the reward for the investment all on the price of the medicine. You can really see not only governments, so there is for example, a draft resolution for the World Health Assembly floated by the European Union, which is all about cooperating for equitable access. And Tony just mentioned an initiative launched by WHO with people at the level of Gates, of President Macron, of Chancellor Merkel, that was launched a few days ago called the ACT Accelerator. That is precisely a push for a massive injection of resources in accelerating research, but on condition of equitable access. What is interesting, you see also big pharmaceutical companies, they see the writing on the wall, and they're already positioning themselves as good corporate citizens. For example, AbbVie, which is a big US biotechnology company, has already informed WHO and other actors that they will not enforce patents for some compounds that have been used in the search for an antiviral. So I think they see the writing on the wall. If they're too greedy, if they go back to the usual sort of high enforcement of patents and so on, it may be the end of a successful corporate career. In broader terms, what should change? WHO and the IHR probably should change. There are things that must be changed in my view. The point is, what is the political appetite for that? It's a bad moment because we are hostages of this China-US diatribe. We are hostages of US electoral policies. And that's not very conducive to a rational strategic conversation on what should be improved and what should be strengthened. In my view, the IHR has several design problems that were made in a rush based on a number of assumptions, like the strength of WHO's recommendatory power that is proved not entirely solid, not entirely sort of confirmed by evidence. So there are things that have to be changed there. Looking outside of the health law confines, I would say what you mentioned before, what Tony said, is disruption in trade, for example, beg at thy neighbors, close the border. That's evidently counterproductive, also from a basic economic analysis. The point is, if you let things escalate into a raging pandemic and countries are unprepared, it is not illogical that a national leader will say, we close the door and we have masks for ourselves, and then we think of the others. The point is how not to reach that point. And so again, I insist on what I said before, we have to strengthen the mechanism to avoid this kind of situation. And one of the points, I think, I hope, we need a sort of forums, preset forum, existing forum. They don't have to be invented during the crisis, for consultations among states in comparing risk assessment. Why are you doing this? Let's coordinate border closure. We want to close the border. We want to minimize disruption. So instead of closing the door, a discussion mediated by WHO, by the UN, I think the actors is relevant in trying to have a more rational, coordinated approach. The issue of access has to be solved, and I think the shock where we are going through, to me, will move things. We'll have a different conversation in the future. So things need to happen at the core of the health law, health institution, but also more broadly on several other aspects of international governance and international law. So there will be a window of opportunity, obviously, that we see countries hopefully vulnerable and open to change. The point is, how long will this window be? Will WHO and other actors be able to use that window? And where we will end up at the end of this window of opportunity? Because the issue is not if the next pandemic comes, it's when the next pandemic comes. We have an acceleration of this health crisis in gravity, intensity, and frequency. So there is no doubt that it will come again. And so really, I hope that this will be a healthy shock in trying to improving the investments, not just the writing in international instruments or having like empty forums, but a concrete investment in preparedness and cooperation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Indeed, this unfortunately will not be our last pandemic. Professor Pangestu, if you could also comment. These will be our last comments before we start taking.
Thank you. In the context of equity, first of all, if you visit the WHO headquarters in Geneva, when you walk in the front door, you see the mission of the organization stated very clearly. The attainment of the highest possible level of health for all people. So it is embedded in the mission of the organization. the equity angle. How is WHO doing that? First, by working with countries to strengthen their health systems, taking into account the social determinants of health to reduce inequalities within populations in developing countries. Secondly, Gianluca has already referred to, WHO has worked very hard to improve access to medicines. In fact, when I was at WHO, there was a move to develop, Gianluca, you remember this, a global R&D treaty, not so much to undo the patent system, but to find alternatives so that medicines become more affordable and accessible. And the third way WHO is doing this is, of course, to establish initiatives. Ayelet's already mentioned CEPI in the context of vaccine development against COVID, but also collaborating with the IMF, with the World Bank, to ensure that vaccines, medical equipment, protective equipment for healthcare workers, that developing countries have fair and equitable access to these products. Not just the development, but to make sure that everybody gets it, not just those who can afford to pay for it. So that's all I'm going to say about equity. In terms of the future, I want to go back to what Prof. Jayakumar said. And I am very dismayed by this sort of blaming each other, all these conspiracy theories. Focus on the job to be done instead of getting involved in all these political polemics and blaming each other. And the objective should be to balance public health action, economic survival, and social equilibrium. How do you do it? More research, more sharing, and more international solidarity through the multilateral organizations to agree on collective action. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ayelet, if you could just give some final comments as well on equity, or also how do we move forward?
I'll focus on how to move forward. So when I think about going forward, I think there are kind of two ways to go. One approach is, and they don't necessarily contradict at all. One is to, reform the international health regulations, reform the WHO. And the other is, do we need new institutions? Do we need a new treaty? So, on the side of the international health regulations, obviously there are many issues. Gianluca mentioned some of them. The main issue is really that everyone's been criticizing is the WHO doesn't have enough power, doesn't have enough enforcement power, and so forth. So, theoretically, these are things that could be improved. However, I think they're almost, unlikely, because states have historically been reluctant about giving such powers to international organizations, and we really don't have any international organization that as such independently has very much powers, with very, very few exceptions. So politically, it might not be that likely to go into that direction. And also, you'd also just need much more funding, because in the end, it's not only just about the rules, even if you change them and amend them. As we've seen, it's also a lot about implementation, and many countries lack the resources and capacity to implement. So, there'd be a lot. Those are issues that definitely would need to be looked at. But also, if we think about, there are many people that are saying there's no need to start everything from scratch. We have an organization, and I too also believe, the WHO and the IHR are things that perhaps could be reformed, but we might also need to think about having a new organization or a new treaty. And I say that because I think if anything has become evident is that it's really not only a health issue, it's linked to so many other issues: human rights, migrants, trade, wildlife protection, all of these issues. So if, there might be also reason to think about having a new organization which would put all of these issues, or a new treaty that would look at these issues in a more holistic form. Voila.
Thank you so much. And Professor Anghie, if you could just say just a few words so we could then go on to the questions from the audience. You need to unmute.
going forward, so I really think we need to, as Ayelet said, we need to understand this as a holistic set of issues. I really feel at the bottom of this, and here I'm making a broad statement, is that the particular type of growth that we are advocating in various ways is a type of growth which causes inequality, and it also causes environmental degradation. And these all together compound this situation of an ongoing danger of pandemics. It seems to me inevitable, because desperate people are going, we can see massive deforestation taking place. We have another phenomenon, which is enormous competition, more debt. And we should also think, I just want to mention, to me, another huge issue is the question about the debt that developing countries are going to face. There's a massive debt already that we can see trillions are being spent by United States. Huge packages are being spent in rich countries. Where are developing countries going to get this money? We're going to see a possibility. I keep in touch with my friends and family in Sri Lanka. We can see clearly the possibility of social unrest, because it's the developing countries which are most affected, the informal sector, tourism, export industries. Those are the industries that have been, you could say, in many ways proposed and encouraged. And those are the industries precisely which are going to be most badly affected. So then there's going to be borrowing. Now the IMF has provided some relief, but then the question is austerity going to become a part of this? Because then in order to repay, we're going to have even further deforestation and so forth, which is going to just compound the situation. I sometimes think that what we really need is a new sense of what international law is about at the bottom line. Ayelet is suggesting a new institution, new principles. I think one of our colleagues is going to talk about solidarity. I find it very interesting that so many people, without necessarily, you could say, intending to do so, have used this word solidarity. It's very interesting. There is such a thing called the right to solidarity. And my friend Obiora Okafor, I'm happy to say, is a special rapporteur for the right to solidarity. Maybe we need to really rethink the way in which our economy, our well-being is being fashioned and thought about. So that's rather broad and vague, but it's a real problem that the world is so divided. Going back to what Professor Jayakumar said, the world is so divided, and states are going to try and further their own interests in these types of situations. Finally, I just want to say, I'm so impressed by Vietnam. Vietnam has done a superb job in managing all this. It's a developing country. It has done a superb job in managing all this. And it has, I think, donated something like 500,000 suits to the United States. It is donating masks to Europe. There is hope. That gives me a lot of hope. And Vietnam says, we feel we should do our part in this global pandemic. And to me, that is a great, wonderful suggestion of global solidarity and the developing countries contributing.
Thank you so much. Well, all I can say is that we have just scratched the surface. And I know that there are many other issues, and I know we have a lot of questions as well. So I thank the panelists for their excellent discussion on this. And before I go to some of the written questions, I do have a special guest, a dear colleague of mine from the International Law Commission, and also a well-known international law professor from South Africa University of Pretoria, Professor Jerry Tlati, who's kindly going to just make some short comments, which I think the audience will very much appreciate. So, Jerry, it's good to see you. Thank you.
It's very good to see you, my friend. Thank you very much for inviting me to say a few words. Let me also just thank you for organizing this, and to thank the panel for what I think was a fascinating discussion. I really did learn a lot. And one thing that struck me sort of listening to all the panelists was it seems clear that pandemics, epidemics, all these outbreaks aren't just health issues, right? So they're more than just health issues. And so it cannot be that we expect the WHO to do everything. It cannot be that we think that the international health regulations are going to do everything. So what you actually have, it seems to me, is you have this patchwork of rules all over the place, which are potentially applicable. So you've got the WHO and its rules and regulations that applies in a very specific health sense. You've got human rights instruments that apply somewhere. You've got investment rules that are applicable. It seems to me that what is really needed from a governance perspective is something that sort of brings all of these things together into a coherent, solid whole that speaks to each other. And so I guess, and this is consistent with what the last couple of speakers said, is that there may well be a need to sort of think about a new legal regime for dealing with pandemics, epidemics, and other outbreaks. And I'll just say a couple of things about what I think this regime must include. I think it must include 3 central elements. I'm sure there are other elements. I'm not going to say anything about the institutional aspects, but it seems to me that there should at least be 3 central elements. The one element, which is, I guess, already contained in the international health regulations, is this idea of science-based decision-making, right? So whatever decisions are made have to be based on science. That, I think, goes without saying, and there'd be very little argument about that. The second, I think, is that it has to be based very much on a respect for human rights. Again, I think that there'd be very little arguments about that. In my own country, we've seen in the enforcement of response measures to the outbreak, we've seen some police brutality, military brutality. So obviously, whatever rules that we put in place have to also be very responsive to human rights. It's a third aspect, and it's the one that was referred to later that I think is perhaps not so obvious, and that's the aspect of solidarity. We have heard a lot in legal literature about this sort of move of international law from a state-centric sense to a more community-based value system, to what John Dugard referred to as a sort of a brave new world in which the human person is at the center and in which there's real solidarity. But the reality is that we haven't really seen this solidarity on the ground, right? So we've seen it in theory, in legal literature, but we haven't really seen it. It's my hope that if we do in fact think about a legal regime, that we would think about making solidarity central. So to what extent are we ensuring that all states are prepared for dealing with outbreaks? To what extent are we going to ensure that in this regime that we're establishing, all states are equally able to address these outbreaks? It's a really critical issue, I think, that we often talk about, but we never really insist on seeing it in practice functioning. I think these are the 3 things that I would hope that a legal regime that we devise would reflect. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your always very insightful views. And I think what we see that there seems to be some appetite for reform, shall we say, or for some expansion. There's a lot on the shoulders of the World Health Organization. And I know there are lots of questions here, and they're really picking up on and something that's been, not surprisingly, concerning state responsibility. The focus has been a bit on China, but I think if we could broaden it up, what is the responsibility of states? Did China live up to that responsibility? There's a lot of questions about that. And I don't want to just focus on China, though, although the questions are. But if you could kind of explain, and one thing too that's come up, what about enforcement mechanisms? In the situation where, let's say, a state has not met its obligation if it's quite clearly determined. So perhaps this question could go to Gianluca and Professor Pangestu. And then we have another question that perhaps Ayelet could answer concerning, well, on the funding, does WHO have a power to request emergency funding from the UN in response to the pandemic? So let me leave that, and then I have a couple of more questions. So I open the floor to respond to the question of responsibility of states under the health regulations, and what authority does the WHO have, and also the WHO, the World Health Organization?
Okay, well, that's obviously a huge question that would deserve its own webinar, probably. And you can see there's a increase in blog posts, in papers coming out precisely on this question. And I think sometimes you can clearly hear law firms sharpening their knives, waiting to attack China in whatever jurisdiction they can find. And President Trump has already given an indication that he likes to see this aspect, to put China on the defensive and so on. I think, first of all, I agree with Tikki. It's not the time now, frankly. We are in the middle of a pandemic, which is probably now moving to Africa in full swing and so on. To start this kind of focusing on recrimination or responsibility may not be very constructive, but the time will come. And I think there are three aspects. First of all, there has to be a serious, let's call it inquiry or review of what was done, what went wrong. Where that review should be done, I'm not sure. If I take Ebola as an example, there were some major reviews by WHO made by a group of independent experts. There were major academic reviews that rose excellent questions. The Secretary General appointed a high-level panel, so there will be no scarcity of forums where these reviews can be done. And that I think is very important. The second is distinguishing, in my view, between accountability and responsibility, which are not synonymous. Because accountability, I think, is broader and raises this issue of consistency with values of the international community. Professor Tladi just mentioned solidarity, just mentioned in a way values that should shape, theoretically, state behavior. When you talk about legal responsibility, then I think things become more complicated because, yes, the international health regulation pose obligations on states. But if you look at them, they're fundamentally procedural obligations, is to partly, in a way, procedural in the sense that they are functional to start a system of international guidance and alert and cooperation. So assess your events, report to WHO, continue to cooperate and provide information and so on. Has China breached those obligations? It's questionable. If you're in a court of law, the facts will be decisive. In terms literally of the days when somebody did or didn't do certain things. And also what to attribute to omissions, whether you can somehow attribute responsibility to the fact that China or other actors did not do things up to a certain moment and so on. So the question of omissions as a source of international responsibility will be very important. But looking outside the IHR, can we say that there are clearly rules of other treaties or customary international law by which, in this case, China, it can be other countries in other emergencies, can be held responsible, legally responsible? Is it a base for responsibility? Can it be enforced in a particular forum? I'm not sure. I see one of the questions raises the principle of do no harm. That I think is very important, and that I think is something that may be developed, may have to be developed in the post-COVID world, because the COVID shows that there must be a clear assertion of this as a legal principle. I think you can use environmental law analogies in the sense that you can exploit your environment, but do no harm to others. I think it's a promising analogy to work on this, but to say that this is unquestionably a principle of customary international law that this time that can be enforced in a court of law, I have my doubts. The IHR don't have strong enforcement mechanism, and that was on purpose. It's not negligence from WHO. It's states that didn't want to have this kind of enforcement. It has also a weak system of dispute settlement, and to me, it's problematic because you don't have the build-up of a body of jurisprudence that can clarify the terms of the IHR, can clarify what is the limit of lawful behavior. And that to me is one of the things that probably should change, because it will help also clarifying the spillover rules that goes beyond just health, but for example, in the do no harm area and so on. So these are some considerations on this point. Thank you.
Professor Pangestu.
Yeah, I think Gianluca has addressed most of the important points here, but I would just like to maybe add to it by saying, repeating what I said before, that you know, WHO does not function as a global health police or inspectorate. It is not a supranational government that can impose sanctions on countries. It cannot compel countries to release information. It cannot criticize or instruct countries. It's guidance, advice through setting norms and standards. So another way of looking at it, the way I see it, is that it has strong moral authority, but limited legal authority. So at the end of the day, how it functions well is through what has been repeated so many times. D-Ray said it, solidarity. Everybody collectively agreeing that as good global citizens, they will comply with the, let's say, the requirements of the IHR in terms of reporting. I have my own personal view about China. I believe there's no truth in the allegations that they tried to hide anything. They sequenced the virus within a week. And you must think in hindsight that when you are fighting that huge epidemic, there are so many things that in hindsight, they could have done better. I do not believe for an instant that they deliberately try to hide or to mask any of the figures.
And thank you. And I think the whole focus on China, when now we're so many months into now the pandemic, and we see that other states have also not necessarily lived up to certain obligations, to be quite honest. So it does raise other questions, and I think that was what, you know, Jerry was raising. Do we have a robust international governance system regime in place? The World Health Organization is important, but perhaps, as you said, it can't do everything. So Ayelet, if I could ask you to share your thoughts on this.
So there was so much focus on China, but I think indeed, I mean, if you look at the international health regulations, the other states have an obligation as well. I mean, Article 13 of the International Health Regulations says that states should be have the capacity to respond promptly and effectively in case of a public health emergency of international concern. And, you know, I don't think it's going to come as a surprise that that hasn't been the case for many countries. We also know that for many countries, especially the public health emergency of international concern was, that declaration was made on the 30th of January. And we know that at least in Western countries, many preparations weren't even starting before middle of March, perhaps also because they didn't have the experience like Asian countries with SARS, so they were much slower. So they appear to not have really been compliant actually with their obligations under the international health regulations. And I mean, in fact, if we look back, now it shouldn't come as a surprise. I think, you know, we had all kinds of expert bodies that were actually already telling us before, and not that many people were listening, that's really the problem, but we have entities like the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board that were saying that countries are essentially not prepared and not implementing their obligations under the international health regulations, so not properly prepared. We have the Global Health Security Index, which also basically ranked countries based on preparedness to a pandemic. And that was a report that came out in 2019, and which said that its findings were that no country is prepared for an epidemic or pandemic. And essentially they gave an average grade for the average. So the ranking was of 195 countries. They ranked them according to different criteria. The absolute grade was 100. The average grade for countries with 2, which at least when I went to school meant you failed class. So most countries were not prepared based on these rankings. I mean, there are problems with these rankings, which I don't think, other problems, because for instance, the United States came out first in the ranking with over 80. So apparently it was better prepared, but of course we have this problem of these gaps between, quite clearly between theory and practice. But maybe that's an issue for a different webinar, those indexes and how they are created. But I guess the point is that yes, also all the other countries, not just China, have not really been prepared and have not, most of them have not really implemented their obligations under the international health regulations in terms of preparedness.
Thank you so much, Ayelet. And Antony, there's actually a specific question for you. I don't know if you saw that. And it has to do specifically, says, thank you for highlighting the role of the IMF. The Asian Development Bank has stepped up too, and speaking from India, the $1.5 billion loan to India is something. However, the larger picture of global governance and how you highlighted the repayment protocol in place, what really can be the future preparedness response? The economic slowdown is a major cause of concern for us. Do you have suggestions for rebuilding governance? And this will be the last question, I think, because amazingly, we're getting close to the end.
So if I might just add to the previous discussion, I think, as several of the commentators said, there are complications with this. I suppose technically, if one looks at just the regulations, you could argue this is an international obligation and it was violated in some way. So I think a lot depends on who's going to view this perspective. But I think the other complication, which we might point out, is the issue about even if there is responsibility, there's the question of reparations. And if we look at, I think it's Article 39 of the draft articles on state responsibility, we have this question about, did you in any way contribute to the injury? And so we're going to have, if China is going to be put under the microscope, China has certainly under the same draft articles a response saying, okay, then we're going to ask, what is your contribution to your own injury? So this is going to be litigation on a scale it's really difficult to conceive of in this context, especially in a context when we can see different countries responding in so many different ways, each believing it is correct. What is the correct way? So I think, lawyers will have a field day, but I'm not sure, what the outcome would be. The other point I want to make is, again, stepping back, this principle of do no harm. Are we going to apply this to the environment? Because if we are going to apply the same principle that what we do in our country is going to affect other people adversely, and therefore we should stop doing it, then I would say there has to be radical transformation in the economies of the United States, in the economy of Australia. Australia, in terms of per individual, has one of the highest carbon footprints in the world. So again, I suppose my method always here is to kind of step back and think, where is this principle going? What are its larger obligations that are created? What are its broader applications? So we're caught up in this immediate moment and we want immediate solutions. And so we grab at what is available. But what are the broader concerns? What are the broader precedents we are applying? I mean, are the Allied forces, I think it's a much clearer, well, we can think of the Iraq war, various other things like that in terms of preparations. In terms of this question specifically asked of me, I think it's a very difficult situation. Again, here, I would say that UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, has a very interesting report about an alternative to the IMF approach. And basically, again, we have this question of which entity has more authority in presenting a proposal to the world. UNCTAD does not have any financial resources. But UNCTAD is saying we are replaying the crisis and we are going to exacerbate it unless we adopt a different approach. And I suppose the approach they are suggesting is really, to many would seem unpalatable, but it is debt forgiveness. And there have been cases of debt forgiveness previously in the history of international relations. But this is a radical time. And unless, I think the other danger we really face here is that this crisis is going to exacerbate inequality. It is going to exacerbate environmental harm. So rather we have to really think very hard about whether our solutions, our so-called solutions, are going to compound the situation. We really might need to rethink, how these institutions operate, what the you could say focus is, and rethink. It's got to be a Marshall Plan. I mean, that was radical. The Marshall Plan was radical, and it worked. Maybe it requires such radical thinking to really deal with an extraordinary situation.
Thank you very much. And I think really remarkably, we've used up practically the full 2 hours. And I want to, first of all, thank the panelists. I think we had a very, very enriching, for me, I learned a lot as well. And I think we could go on this. We will be talking about this, not just the pandemic, but clearly the consequences, the repercussions. There are many other questions here. But ultimately, what we have seen is that the current system perhaps is just not built strong enough to deal with the pandemic as it is. And so we will be looking to what changes can be made, but we're in the middle of it, so it's quite early. So I want to thank very much our panelists for just excellent discussion that they provided us. And definitely I have to thank this audience who's stuck with us through this time. I did try and condense the questions. Many of them had to do with the state responsibility, but do forgive me if I was not able to select all of your questions. But I do appreciate that you spent the time with us. We still have 243 people here. So I think that's something that we're very pleased with. And I'm sorry we can't see you. I wish we could. That's the one downside of this virtual world. We don't have the physical contact. But we really, I think on behalf of all of us, we thank you very much for your interest in this. And stick with us. We will continue talking about these very critical existential issues. There's no doubt about it. I was not aware of this area is fascinating and we're living it. And I'm just so delighted that we had such a panel of experts to be with us today. So thank you very, very much. And I wish you all well, good health, and may we return in better days. And thank you, Prof. Jaya, as well, for your wonderful opening. Goodbye to everyone.